In the isolated depths of Dismal Creek, Scott and Sean believed they were performing a heroic act by feeding a frail, helpless old man they found wandering the woods. Little did they know, the man they invited to their campfire was actually the most feared monster in the history of the Appalachian Trail, a notorious serial killer who had returned to his old hunting grounds. The warmth of the dinner was shattered in an instant when the old man suddenly drew a weapon and began a brutal, senseless human hunt. Why would this man betray those who saved him, and what chilling secrets lay behind the collection of women's clothing and bizarre rituals that police later discovered in his hidden lair? Before we get into the story, so that we can get to know each other better, I would like to know which cities this content is distributed to and what time you watch it. Please like, comment, and subscribe so that this channel continues to grow. Thank you.
On the afternoon of May 6th, 2008, a 54-year-old man called Ricky Williams stood on the riverbank casting out his line into the waters of Dismal Creek in western Virginia. Ricky was hoping to get lucky and catch some trout, but he'd been out here fishing for 30 minutes so far, and there were no bites. Normally, Ricky wouldn't care because he loved just fishing for hours and hours at a time. But today, he and his dog, who was right with him, were really hungry because they'd been out in these woods camping for several weeks now, and their food supply was finally dwindling down to the end. And so if they didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Now, for context, where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, despite its bleak name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain that was on the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is a very famous 2,200-mile-long trail that runs up and down the east coast of the United States. And why that is relevant is because there's this special code for people that hike on the Appalachian Trail. And the code, which all hikers know, is basically if you come across another hiker on the Appalachian Trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need help. And it is their responsibility to help you if you need help. So it's this community of hikers that are always looking to help each other. And so Ricky was very aware of this code on the Appalachian Trail, and he was secretly hoping, as he cast his line over and over again and didn't get any bites, that a hiker or a group of hikers might come by this area, and maybe they would see him and come down and learn that he needed food, and they might just give him some of their food. But another half hour passed and no hikers came by, and still Ricky could not catch any fish. But then suddenly, Ricky's dog, who was right next to him, began to whine and kind of began shifting around like it was sensing a predator in the area or something. But as Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he began to hear a voice in the woods right behind him. Somebody was moving towards him. And when Ricky heard this voice, on the one hand, he was pretty excited because maybe this is a hiker who can give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Now, you need to understand that Ricky was an older guy, he was kind of frail, and over the past few weeks that he'd been camping with his dog, as his food supply had run down, he had become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, and so he really did not pose any sort of threat to anybody. He's like this weak older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place, but over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail, and in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time, he couldn't help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer, and then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line, and he looks over and he sees Ricky, and for a second, the two men just kind of look at each other. But then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately Ricky felt relieved because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and a bag of chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky so he too could cast out again. And for the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting and they did start catching fish, so the day kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky. And it got even better because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner. And remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation. And he said, yes, of course, I'd love to join you. So the two men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, go on ahead. My campsite's right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill, and you'll see it. Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, no, it's totally fine, go ahead. So Ricky said, okay, and he walked the rest of the way up the hill, and then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire.
This massive figure, presumably Scott's companion, caught the sound of Ricky entering the clearing. Keep in mind, it's the dead of night in a remote location. The man slowly turns around, only to find a complete stranger standing right there, but Scott has completely vanished.
And so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, what are you doing here? And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and he said, I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right site. I'm sorry. But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line, and he patted Ricky on the back, and he said, oh, you've already met my friend Sean. And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he basically let his guard down. He put the wood down, and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky felt like Sean was not happy that Ricky was in his campsite, even though clearly Scott is the reason that Ricky is in this campsite. And so Ricky just felt really uncomfortable. And at the same time, Scott is ushering Ricky closer to the campfire to take a seat next to Sean. Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. Take a seat. Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was really forcing him to stay. But Ricky didn't want to be rude and just kind of abruptly leave, so he did take a seat next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to Ricky, and Ricky just kind of sat there waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next is Scott walked over to Sean and handed off all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so that Sean could begin to prepare them, to cook them. And then as Ricky is still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire up to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. And Scott turned on the radio and began blasting country music. And when Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced because to him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. And so it felt kind of like borderline disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. And so to Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like there's something off about these two guys. They just seem really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe aggressive. And so Ricky is just not happy. But again, Ricky didn't say anything and didn't attempt to leave because, again, he's really hungry and so is his dog, and he needs to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean, and then he, along with Sean, pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. And as they were doing this, Ricky, again, is just kind of sitting there doing nothing, and so he kind of meagerly asked, hey, can you give me a knife and I'll clean a fish? But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, don't worry, we got this. And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously as all he could watch was the flashing of the light bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish and they put their knives away. And at that point, they began cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly for Ricky, it felt like, the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now the two men were not fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. And so Ricky began making some small talk in hopes that would kind of, settle his nerves. And so Ricky told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. And Ricky would tell the men that, sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for Ricky. And he would even tell Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting like part of a ritual. I mean, he was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed the two men were definitely paying attention and kind of nodding along at appropriate points in the story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like Ricky was kind of weird, as if they were not prepared to come out and say it. But after hearing all these things about his life, it was like, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seem like they don't quite like him or even really want him here. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish were done, and so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, right about 8 p.m., it was very dark outside, and Ricky at this point is just ready to go. He just felt so uneasy here. And so after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up and grabbed his dog, and he began walking into the woods towards his campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from this campsite, two things happened in rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky and Sean and Scott had been, there were these two women who were in their house eating dinner when they heard this sudden frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women live in a very isolated part of the country, and so the women were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other very carefully made their way towards the front of the house, and they kind of peered out the window, but they couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark, and so they went to their door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there, and the woman, she unlocked the door, and she opened it just a crack, and what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood, as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he is all red. And the man had his hand over his neck. And the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out of his neck that was in time with his heart. This man is clearly bleeding to death.
So the woman frantically screamed for her companion to call emergency services, shouting that someone was dying right there. As the call was being placed, the man on the porch weakly pleaded for help, murmuring something about Dismal Creek before he suddenly slumped to the ground.
And this was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house that she hadn't even registered until now. And so either this guy got dropped off or he drove that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. And then the medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, and they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who's shown up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so instead of trying to wait to figure out what was even going on, police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around and see if we can figure out, why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road coming straight at them. And the truck, they initially hit their brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again, and they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment, and they crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. And the police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen and they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their car and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver, and he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance, but they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Because remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. And once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seems like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lives here. So the campsite was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area. So you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses, and there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent, and all over this map along the trail were all these spots that were circled, but there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio, and inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play, and immediately what they heard totally creeped them out, because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew, and in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail definitely would know this name. And the identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too, and they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face, and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean, at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott, and he shoots at him, and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot the second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy, Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they shut the door and they speed their way towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep, and both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother and he wore this electronic bracelet and, he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had came off, and even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable. He didn't have enough money, and so ultimately he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on May 6th, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981 or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell and very likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This is his home. This is the place he loves more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall because, amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own, and so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously, that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database, and so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of obviously Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth, because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest, and Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking, and they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing. On the night of January 3rd, 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside of a local pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling totally annoyed. Now, normally, Thomas was a very upbeat and social person. He worked as a bricklayer, and basically every day after work, he would meet up with his friends at this pub. They would have some drinks and share stories and laugh. It would be a great time. But tonight, it was like everything annoyed Thomas, especially his friends. And as his friends droned on and on about the current drama going on in their town, Thomas finally had just had enough, and before he could stop himself, he stood up and slammed his beer mug down on the table, and right away Thomas knew he had overdone it, because immediately the pub went deadly silent, his friends all stopped, everybody's looking over at Thomas, and Thomas kind of muttered an apology, and then quickly grabbed his coat, he stood up, and just began walking like he was going to leave the pub. And the pub, again, is totally silent as he's walking, and then right as he's about to go out the door, his friends broke the tense silence in the pub, and they called out to him and said, "Hey, be careful out there." And Thomas just looked at his friends and kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, okay." And then he went outside. Thomas decided he would walk to his parents' house, which was not far away, and he would just sit by the fire and warm up for a bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked long hours and she often worked late. And when she worked late, Thomas would meet her at work and escort her back home. And that's what he was doing tonight. And so Thomas began walking down Black Lion Lane, and per usual, Thomas was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be this very friendly and bustling place. It was home to 45,000 people. It was located right on the outskirts of London, and lots of rich people like to go there to vacation. But recently, there had been a string of all these increasingly bizarre sightings, or attacks as people were calling them, in Hammersmith, and it had all the residents completely on edge to the point where people were not going outside. Now, Thomas thought it was totally ridiculous and thought people were completely overreacting, and so he had been doing his best to ignore the drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a corner, he nearly walked into two men that were walking the other direction. And when Thomas looked up to say he was sorry, one of the men screamed, "Get back!" And he was holding a club in his hand, and the other guy had a pistol in his waist, and he had his hand on the pistol grip. Thomas instinctively threw his hands up to show he was not a threat, at which point the man lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol, and one of them said to Thomas, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone. You should not be out here by yourself." And then before Thomas could say anything to them, they quickly walked past him and disappeared around the corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' house, and so he just kind of brushed off the incident and sped walked his way to his parents' house, kind of cursing the two men under his breath for their ridiculous warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house, and he walked up to the door, and normally his parents would keep the door unlocked. But when he tried it, it was locked, and then a second later, he heard his sister, Anne, inside the house coming to the door, and she called out through the door, "Who's there?" And Thomas is like, "It's me, Anne." But apparently that was not enough. And Anne called through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see you through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes, but he did what his sister asked. He stepped back and allowed her to see his whole person through the peephole, at which point he heard Anne fumbling with the lock. The door was unlocked. She opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door behind him. And her first question to Thomas was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house to avoid talking about this stupid topic, but he realized that if he had gone back to his house, he likely would have gotten the same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. Because actually, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to, because the conversation was always going to be the same. It was going to be about these attacks, because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely convinced these attacks were being committed by a ghost. It all started about 2 months earlier when somebody spotted this mysterious figure lurking in the church cemetery. And Thomas thought really the hysteria should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after the sighting, it was figured out that the figure was actually just the butcher's son. And he was just dressing up in women's clothes, walking around in the cemetery to scare his friends. It was a prank. That was it. But the hysteria in town did not go away, because a week after this first weird sighting, there was another sighting in the cemetery. A local chimney sweep said he saw someone walking around in the cemetery who disappeared into the ground. Now, admittedly, a lot of people in Hammersmith, when they heard about this second sighting, they did kind of brush it off as just hysteria.
However, it was only after the second sighting that the alleged attacks in town truly began. Late one night, as a local resident was passing the graveyard, something emerged from the shadows behind them and started to choke them.
And this resident was able to break free and run away to safety, but they turned and got a look at whatever was attacking them, and they described it as a phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was going past the cemetery when they got out for some reason, and then this creature with horns on its head came charging out and confronted the carriage driver, who apparently just turned and ran away, abandoning his 8 horses and 16 passengers. And so by late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings in town that basically everybody in Hammersmith, save for basically Thomas, was totally gripped by fear. And as terror kind of spread across town, Thomas had attempted to convince his wife and mother-in-law and his family that there was just no way this was a real ghost. This is people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. That's all this is. But Thomas's theory was really put into question when just a few days earlier, so a few days before he stormed out of the pub because he was so annoyed, somebody had died following one of these attacks. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 p.m. at night.
As a figure emerged from the cemetery soil, it darted toward her and seized her. She only managed a quick glance, catching a glimpse of a flowing white robe and a tall, tapered white hat before everything went dark and she lost consciousness.
Then she woke up again and she was in somebody's house and her neighbors were all around her. They had found her passed out in the cemetery and carried her there. And so she comes to and she's only able to choke out the story of what happened to her, the ghost attack, before she died. And so following this pregnant woman's death, the town of Hammersmith offered a reward for anybody who could capture or kill the ghost, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith Ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols. In fact, those 2 men that Thomas had turned the corner and bumped into, one guy had the club, the other guy had a gun, those guys were on their own patrol. And so the ghost and how to capture or kill it was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about, and it totally annoyed Thomas. It was what was being talked about at the pub by his friends when he got so mad he slammed the cup down and left the pub. To Thomas, the idea of capturing or killing a ghost made no sense because a ghost is not real. Now, by this point, the butcher's son had come out and said, look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the first one. And he had an alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was not a person. To Thomas, he just felt like, okay, then there's somebody else in town that's just copying the butcher's son's prank, except obviously they've taken the pranks too far because they've gotten someone killed. At about 10 p.m., Thomas was inside of his parents' house, sitting by the fire, just kind of beginning to doze off. And as he sat there, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go out into the freezing cold night to go walk with his wife all the way back home. He'd much rather just stay here and sleep for the night and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she exploded on him and was like, are you kidding me? You're going to let your wife walk home alone in this environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Get out there and protect your wife. Thomas was like, okay. And he got up, he grabbed his jacket, and he walked outside. As soon as Thomas was outside, he was feeling so annoyed at the current situation that he found himself thinking, you know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost, the person disguised as a ghost, I'm going to bum rush them and beat them up. And it will prove to the entire town that there was never any ghost. It was just a person the whole time. And so Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and immediately he saw this big bush off to the side of the road on the sidewalk, and he could have sworn behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down, like they were trying to hide. And so Thomas stopped and he squinted in the direction of this bush, and then at some point he saw movement enough to confirm to him that that must be a person back there, and suddenly it clicked for Thomas. That must be the person pretending to be this ghost. That's the prankster / murderer. There they are. And so without any hesitation, Thomas balled up his fists and just started sprinting towards this person. At virtually the exact same time, Anne, Thomas's sister, was still in their parents' house, and she was looking out the window kind of roughly in the direction that Thomas had gone, and she heard this loud scream that sounded like a man. Now, she couldn't see her brother, but she's thinking, oh my God, it's coming roughly from the area where he went. What if he's getting attacked by the ghost? And so she bolted outside. Just a couple of minutes after that, a big posse of men came tumbling out of that pub where Thomas had been drinking earlier that night and got really mad and slammed his cup down. So they come stumbling out of the pub, and they were being led not by the night watchman who was amongst the posse, but instead they were being led by the town's tax collector, a man named Francis Smith, who looked totally disheveled and out of breath and did not look like the type of guy who would be leading a big posse. But here we were. He was leading this posse, and he took them down the road, and they turned the corner onto Black Lion Lane. And as soon as they looked down that same road that Thomas had been on and then seen the person in the bush, the posse, they stopped because they saw a body in the middle of the road, and it didn't appear to be moving. And then crouched over the body was this dark figure that was kind of hunched over this body. And the figure turned and it looked at the posse and let out this unbelievable scream. And the posse just kind of backed up and didn't know what to do. But then the night watchman broke ranks and just began sprinting at the creature that was perched over the body. And the watchman tackled the creature onto the ground and kind of pinned it there. At the same time, the rest of the posse, seeing an opening, rushed over to the body in the road to see if maybe they were alive and if maybe they could help this person. But unfortunately, when they got to the body, they could tell this person was dead.
The search party was convinced they had stumbled upon the latest victim of the Hammersmith ghost, as well as the ghost itself, the dark figure that the watchman had wrestled to the ground. However, they couldn't have been more wrong.
When Thomas had rounded the corner onto Black Lion Lane and he looked into that bush and he saw that figure moving around, it really was a person. It was not a ghost. It was a human being. It was Francis Smith, the town's tax collector, and he was hiding behind the bush. However, Francis was not hiding behind the bush because he was pretending to be the Hammersmith ghost, like Thomas was assuming, which is why he ran after him. Instead, Francis was hiding behind that bush because he was basically laying in wait for the Hammersmith ghost. He was hoping the ghost would walk past him and he could run out and capture or kill this thing and get the reward. Basically, Francis was doing the same thing Thomas was doing. The only difference was Francis actually believed in the ghost and Thomas did not. And it was just Thomas's bad luck that that night he had chosen to wear his all-white work clothes, which to Francis, who's hiding in the bush, terrified and waiting for the ghost, he sees Thomas in these white clothes and he was absolutely convinced he was the Hammersmith ghost. And so when the two men spotted each other, they both attacked, except Francis had a rifle. And so when Thomas ran up to him to basically punch him in the face, Francis just raised his gun and fired. And the bullet hit Thomas directly in the face, which killed him instantly. But after shooting and killing Thomas, Francis had no idea that it was a real person. He was so jacked up on adrenaline that he did think he shot the ghost, but didn't know if the ghost was actually dead or not. And he didn't want to be alone when he checked. So he just turned and ran to the pub, gathered up the posse and said, "Hey, I got the ghost, come on." And they all ran back to Black Lion Lane. And when they got there, Thomas's sister, Anne, who heard that scream, she had made it to her brother's body. And she was the creature crouched over him, screaming out of grief. That's all she was doing. She had just found her dead brother and was reacting to it when the watchman tackled her to the ground. But luckily, the posse quickly realized this is not a ghost. This is Thomas and his sister. And so his sister was not harmed. And so on January 11th, 1804, Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But 5 weeks later, the King of England would pardon Francis and shorten his sentence to just 1 year. The Hammersmith ghost incident was debated for more than 150 years, and ultimately it led to a modern-day ruling that says a person is allowed to use self-defense if they truly and reasonably believe they're in danger, even if they are wrong about the danger they face. The true identity of the Hammersmith ghost, not the very first one, which we know was the butcher's son, but all the other instances, all the other attacks, well, it would turn out it was the town's shoemaker who would confess to his crime following Thomas's murder. He would tell people that the only reason he did it was to get revenge on his apprentices who had really badly scared his children by telling them ghost stories.
One night in April of 1919, a middle-aged man named Eric Marth woke up in his bedroom in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because his entire bed was shaking. He saw his wife, Margaret, was lying next to him and she was thrashing around and gasping for air. But Eric didn't panic because he knew exactly what was happening. So Eric and Margaret had moved into this house just a few weeks ago. But pretty much right away after moving in, Margaret had begun having these very intense nightmares that would wake her up almost violently, like what was happening right now. Now, from Eric's perspective, these nightmares she was having looked horrifying, but there really was not any physical risk to Margaret. I mean, she would just have these horrible visceral dreams and kind of shake around, but that was it. And so, like he had been doing the past couple of weeks, Eric just reached over and gently put his hands on his wife's shoulders and began repeating her name very gently over and over again to try to kind of get her out of this trance she was in. And sure enough, a moment later, Margaret, who kind of stopped flailing, she let out this huge gasp. And then she sat up straight and panted for air. And she turned to her husband and she said, "I saw the ghost again." And when Eric heard this, he wasn't like, "Oh my goodness, there's a ghost." Instead, he was just kind of annoyed. And so he did his best to comfort her, but he's just thinking, what in the world is going on here? So a few years ago, Margaret had joined the spiritualism movement, which was a very popular religious movement at the time. And spiritualists thought they could contact the dead. Now, Eric absolutely did not believe in ghosts, and he was pretty sure that Margaret's staunch belief in spiritualism was now effectively causing these nightmares. That it was not the house, it was just her belief system. It was kind of manifesting in these nightmares. However, Margaret felt the opposite. She felt like it was the house itself that was haunted. And it was haunted by a vengeful spirit that attacked her every night in these dreams. Now, Eric, it's the middle of the night. He's tired. He's annoyed. He didn't feel like discussing whatever she believed about this ghost right now. So after she said, "I saw the ghost, I saw the spirit again," he just told her to, calm down, go back to sleep. But on this night, Margaret didn't lie down. She actually turned to Eric and she said, "No, I have to figure out what's going on. I have to figure out who this ghost is and why they're haunting me." A week later, a very resigned Eric sat at his kitchen table next to Margaret, and across from them sat a medium, which is a person who spiritualists believed could talk directly to the dead by conducting a ritual called a seance. The medium began to light some candles, and as they did, they told Eric and Margaret to close their eyes because she was ready to begin the seance, where she would ask the spirit haunting their house what it wanted, and they needed, silence and their eyes closed to do that. So Eric fully believed that this seance would be a waste of time and money. He didn't believe in this stuff at all. But he knew his wife did, and it meant a lot to her. And so he's thinking, maybe this can help my wife sleep through the night again. And so Margaret and Eric did as they were told. And Eric, he closed his eyes and he listened as the medium began clearly rocking back and forth in her chair and began sort of dramatically calling out to the ghost and telling him to reveal himself. And at first, nothing happened, which was exactly what Eric had expected. But after a minute, Margaret suddenly jumped up from the table and ran out of the kitchen across the living room. And Eric, not knowing any better, just got up and followed her. And Margaret, she ran down the hallway and she threw open a door that led down to their cellar and she raced down the steps. Now, Eric was doing his best not to ridicule what was happening here and just to play along. But it's like, what is his wife doing? What's happening here? And so as he's chasing after his wife, he starts saying like, "Honey, what's going on here? Where are you going? What is this?" But she didn't respond. It was like she was on a mission. And then finally, when Eric got down the steps and he's in the cellar, he saw his wife, who was now standing in the middle of the cellar with her arms out wide. And slowly, she began to point to a spot on the floor. And in this really weird and hollow voice with this sort of vacant expression on her face, she told Eric to dig. Now, at this point, Eric was totally freaked out. Not because he believed that the seance had worked or that there was a ghost here, but because his wife genuinely was acting totally bizarre. I mean, she was acting possessed. And even if that was an act, it was a terrifying one. And so he just said no. There was no way he was just going to start digging up the cellar floor. Like, what is going on here? But then the medium came rushing down the stairs as well. And they said that Margaret was in a trance, that the ghost in this house was channeling her, and that basically Eric had to do whatever the ghost said. Suddenly, Margaret's voice cut across the room again, and she said to Eric to dig up the floor. And this time she was more forceful and almost desperate, like, "You must do this." And so Eric, he's looking at his wife, he's looking at the medium, like, what in the world is happening here? But he's like, you know what? I don't know what's happening. I'm just going to dig. I'm going to do what they tell me to. And so he grabbed a shovel and just began digging up the cellar. And after just a few minutes, Eric's shovel hit something in the ground, something hard. He thought it was just maybe like a big rock or something. But a few minutes later, after he and the medium and also Margaret, who's now come over at this point, they'd kind of cleared off whatever it was, they saw in the ground, what had previously been covered by the earth was this rotten wooden box. And so he and Margaret and the medium, they pulled it out of the hole and they opened up the lid. And all three of them immediately recoiled because inside of the box was a human skeleton. And so after a minute of just, again, stunned silence,
Eric glanced up at Margaret, who appeared eerily unfazed by the sight before them. It felt like a grim confirmation. He asked her, his voice trembling, Is this the skeleton of the ghost that's been haunting you? Margaret, speaking in that same hollow tone that didn't even sound like her own, looked at him and simply said, no. As it happened, according to the local legend surrounding the events of that house.
That the ghost was a doctor who used to live in the house that Eric and Margaret moved into. And 18 years earlier, this doctor had performed an illegal surgery on a young woman, and this woman had died during this procedure. But again, because this surgery had been illegal, the doctor knew if word of what happened here got out, he would be arrested. So what did he do? He dismembered the girl's body and shoved it into this wooden box, filled the box with quicklime, and then he buried it in his basement. And amazingly, the doctor never got caught for what he did. And so he basically spent the rest of his life feeling very ashamed and guilty. And then finally, when he did die, it was like his spirit couldn't actually rest until he confessed. And so this haunting was basically to get Margaret to go down into the basement and see what he had done. One afternoon in April of 1925, a wealthy teenager named Lacey raced his horse around the huge estate where he lived in eastern Hungary and took in all the land that he knew he would inherit someday. He stopped when he reached the gardens on the far side of the estate. But before he could ride his horse into the gardens as he wanted to, a field worker ran up to Lacey and asked him to stop and turn around. The field worker, who was about Lacey's age, explained that Lacey was not allowed to ride his horse through the garden anymore because the last time he had rode through some flower beds and Lacey's father was really mad about it. And at this, Lacey felt totally exasperated because he was tired of his father always bossing him around. And it embarrassed him to be reminded of this by someone as low class as a field worker. So Lacey's family was part of the noble class. His dad was a baron and his mother was a baroness, and they lived together in an old castle on this beautiful estate. And for the most part, Lacey loved his noble life, but his father could be harsh and really controlling. And sometimes Lacey dreamed of the day that he would inherit his dad's title, because then he, Lacey, would be in charge of the estate and he could finally run things the way he wanted. And so Lacey decided he wanted to show his father and this field worker and the other field workers that they couldn't order him around all the time. And so he rode his horse right into the gardens and intentionally rode all over their prized flower beds. Lacey's plan was to head back home and go into the castle and talk to his father about that field worker's rudeness. But when Lacey got back to the castle, he didn't have a chance to even speak to his father because that whole day his dad was very busy with estate matters. And then that night, his father died of a heart attack. A week after his father's death, Lacey walked through the crowded banquet hall in his family's castle looking for his mother because he wanted to make sure that she was okay. He and his mom had just gotten home from his dad's funeral, and now they were hosting a reception for everyone who had attended. But Lacey couldn't find his mother anywhere inside of this banquet hall, and with a sinking feeling, he realized there was only one place she could be. So after Lacey's father had died, his mother had gone a little bit crazy. She refused to believe that her husband had died of a heart attack and instead kept insisting that he had been murdered. More specifically, she thought he had been scared to death because when she had seen his body for the first time, his facial expression looked horrified, like he was actually scared as he died. Now, the doctor had explained to her that it was entirely possible that his heart attack came on suddenly and he was scared about what was happening to him and so, was scared when he died. But the Baroness wouldn't listen. She said this was intentional. Somebody did this to him. And so ever since, she had basically spent all of her time in Lacey's father's bedroom searching for clues about her husband's supposed killer. So now, Lacey left the banquet hall and climbed the stairs up the castle up to his father's bedroom. And just as he suspected, when he knocked on the door, his mom answered, looking totally frantic. Lacey told her to come downstairs and say hello to their guests, but she said no, that she was too busy looking for evidence. Then, before Lacey could say anything, his mom just shut the door in his face. The next 6 months went by basically the same way. Lacey's mother spent all her time locked up in the Baron's bedroom around the clock, and Lacey spent most of his time riding his horse, including in the garden, because he didn't like going home anymore. His mother was now technically in charge of the family estate, but she had really let things go since her husband had died. She basically had not taken up any of the responsibilities that she was now in charge of. And so at this point, Lacey really couldn't wait until he was on his own and in charge of the castle and the estate himself. One night in mid-October, so this is at the 6-month mark from when Lacey's father had died, Lacey ate dinner alone, which was common at this point since his mom basically still refused to come downstairs at all. And then after he ate dinner, Lacey began making his way upstairs to get ready for bed. And as he walked upstairs, Lacey just felt overcome with anger and desperation and just kind of general angst about the current situation. He longed so desperately to just be alone and in charge of the estate. He hated the current setup with his mother in charge, but not really doing anything. I mean, the whole estate was just falling apart here. But eventually, despite feeling kind of riled up, Lacey, got into bed and closed his eyes and did eventually begin to drift off to sleep. But right after he had fallen asleep, he was suddenly awoken by this ear-piercing scream that was echoing down the hallway. And he realized it was his mother, and she was screaming for help. And so Lacey jumped out of bed and he raced down the hallway to his father's bedroom. And as he ran, other servants were flooding the hallway, racing towards the room as well. And Lacey, he got to the door, he unlocked it, and he rushed inside. And when he got in there, he saw his mother pointing at the foot of the Baron's bed. And she was saying that a demon had appeared in the bedroom and had loomed over her like it wanted to kill her. And so she told Lacey that the demon had to be what scared his father to death. The demon was the murderer. Lacey's mother looked absolutely convinced here. But Lacey, and really all the servants as well, just kind of collectively sighed.
Since there was clearly no demonic presence at the foot of the bed, it was evident his mother had either suffered a nightmare or was simply losing her mind. As the servants retreated to their quarters to give the family some privacy to handle the ordeal,
Lacey told his mother to just go back to sleep here. And then he turned and walked back down to his room, feeling completely defeated, because to Lacey, his mom was basically losing her mind here. And he had no idea how he was going to help, or really how much longer this current setup was going to last. But this was awful. On both of the next 2 nights, Lacey woke up yet again to the sound of his mother screaming about a demon inside of the Baron's bedroom. And so by the 3rd morning, Lacey had just had enough. He decided he was going to force his mother out of that bedroom and insist that she come downstairs and eat breakfast with him and just act normal for once. However, when he walked to the Baron's bedroom and knocked on the door to speak to his mother, it was not his mom who answered. It was a police detective. Lacey was stunned, and he walked into the bedroom and saw his mother, who was standing there with 2 more detectives. And Lacey asked, what's going on here? Lacey's mother explained that she had called the police to help her catch the demon that was haunting her at night and very likely was responsible for killing her husband. And at this point, Lacey thought he might die of embarrassment. I mean, this was unbelievable that now the police were involved. But instead of talking about that, he just begged his mother to please send the police home. They do not need to be here. But his mother refused. She was fully committed to the idea that there was a demon here and the police were going to help her find it. And the police, to be honest, looked like they didn't really know what was going on. They were just kind of trying to figure out if this was serious or not, or if there was some sort of intruder, but they were just kind of like, we'll see. And so Lacey finally just turned, left, hopped on his horse, and went for his daily ride. That night, as Lacey crawled into his own bed, he knew that down the hallway, his mom was already in bed, and that 3 detectives were watching over her room in case a demon appeared. Again, Lacey felt unbelievably embarrassed by this. To even be affiliated with this was just excruciating, but he managed to close his eyes and go to sleep. But like normal, at some point in the middle of the night, he woke up because his mother was screaming. And Lacey, he's like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. It's only getting worse. But he got out of bed, he went into the hallway, and he began walking down towards where his mother was, where she was screaming inside of the Baron's bedroom, expecting that, once again, the room would be empty and the police would see, this is just complete delusion here. There's no demon, there's no problem. However, when Lacey got to the doorway and looked inside, he saw one of the detectives running across the room and then tackle something that really did look like a demon to the floor. And then Lacey's mother turned on the light. It would turn out that even though Lacey fully expected to inherit his father's title, he was actually not the Baron's firstborn son. Before the Baron had met the Baroness, Lacey's mother, he'd had a relationship with a local peasant woman, and they had had a son together. And the Baron had given that peasant woman a plot of land on the edge of the estate to raise their son in secret. And then the Baron had basically abandoned them both. He had given them the opportunity to, work on the estate and sort of make a living for themselves, but functionally, he didn't interact with them at all. He didn't recognize them at all. They were on their own. Now, the peasant woman, the mother of this child, had sort of accepted that this was their reality, but the secret son had sort of buried that feeling forever until Lacey rode his horse through the gardens, despite being told not to, and destroyed those flower beds. Because the secret son was that field worker. His job was looking out for the gardens, and it just felt like a step too far. And so the secret son, the field worker, decided he was going to teach this family a lesson. He was going to kill the Baron and the Baroness by scaring them to death. That was his plan. And it sort of worked. He went into the castle and pretended to be a demon in the middle of the night, and he scared the father, the Baron, so badly, he literally had a heart attack and died. However, the secret son continued pretending to be a demon around the Baroness after killing the Baron, and the Baroness would get really, really scared and would scream and claim there's a demon in here. But she didn't die from this. She did not have a heart attack. And so ultimately, the plan was foiled. And so in the end, there was no demon. It was just Lacey's half-brother wrapped in a cloak, wearing a horrifying mask. One morning in early August of 1927, a 24-year-old woman named Inez Perry walked in the back door of the farmhouse where her parents lived in rural Vermont. And as soon as she walked in, she went into the kitchen where her father was at the kitchen table with a man she had never seen before, and the two were shaking hands, and she heard her father say, "We have a deal." And then right after that, Inez's father looked over and saw her, and he explained that this man's name was Clarence Sinclair, and that he and Clarence had just agreed to swap houses. And for a second, Inez was confused, but then it all clicked into place. So Inez's parents had raised her and her other 3 siblings in this farmhouse, but Inez and her siblings had all moved away, and her parents were getting older. Her dad's health in particular was starting to fail, and keeping up the farmhouse was getting to be too much for him. And so her father had been trying to sell the property for a while, but nobody seemed to want it. However, now it seemed like he had finally found a solution. Her dad explained to her that Clarence and his family would move into this farmhouse and take over the farm. And in exchange, he and Inez's mom would move into Clarence's house just a few towns over. Now, to Inez, this arrangement did seem a little strange, but it also did solve her parents' problem. And so even though she was going to be sad to say goodbye to her childhood home, she decided that this had to be the right move for her parents. And so she said, that's great. A few weeks later, Inez was inside of her parents' new house, helping to get them settled in and organize their living room, when she heard the clattering sound of a horse-drawn wagon coming down the street and coming to a stop right outside. So she walked to the door and she opened it up. But the second she saw who it was that was getting out of the carriage, she slammed the door and locked it. Because the person getting out of that carriage was Clarence Sinclair, the man who Inez's dad had swapped homes with. And the home swap had not gone how Inez and her family had hoped. Inez's parents were thrilled with their new house, so everything on their side was good. But pretty much immediately after actually doing the swap, Clarence had started acting totally unhinged. He had come back to his old home repeatedly without being invited, and he would beg Inez's dad to switch houses back, that he had made a horrible mistake. But Clarence would never elaborate. He would never really explain why he felt this way. He would just, demand, please, I've made a horrible mistake. We have to switch back. But Inez's dad had said no. A deal was a deal, and he just had too many health issues to live at that farmhouse anymore. And Clarence couldn't actually cite any real problems with the farmhouse that he so desperately wanted to, give back. And so as far as Inez's dad was concerned, the subject here was closed. He had not given him a faulty property, and there was no real reason here to go back to the way it was. And so it was a no. So now Inez and her parents watched from the window as Clarence hopped out of his wagon and came rushing onto the porch. And he looked absolutely crazy. His hair was messed up and greasy, and there were dark circles under his eyes, and he really looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. And Clarence promptly began pounding on the front door, shouting that his family could not live in their farmhouse, and that this was now a matter of life and death. But eventually, when Inez and her family refused to come out, Clarence finally gave up, turned around, got in his wagon, and drove away. Now, that was the last time that Clarence came to their house. But it was not the last time that Inez and her family would hear about their old farmhouse. A few weeks later, on November 4th, after several days of very heavy rainfall, Inez picked up the newspaper and saw that their old neighborhood had been basically washed away by historic flooding. And that included their old farmhouse. It had literally been carried off. And the family that had been living in the farmhouse were dead. But that family was not Clarence Sinclair's family. It would turn out that after Clarence and his family had moved into said farmhouse, Clarence began having these horrible dreams where his dead mother would appear to him and tell him to move out of this farmhouse right now because something terrible is going to happen here. Now, at first, Clarence ignored this and chalked it up to a bad dream, but the dream kept happening over and over and over again, and it was driving him mad. And so eventually, he did go to Inez and Inez's parents and tried to switch it back because he felt like this dream really meant something. But Inez's father just kept saying no and said, no, that's your house now. And so Clarence never elaborated to the family about why he wanted this back because it made no sense to him either, but he ultimately listened to his dead mother in his dream, and he wound up just selling the farmhouse just to not live there anymore. And so that decision would ultimately save Clarence and his family. But it would also condemn to death the family who moved in.
On the night of May 3rd, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and just listened really intently to figure out, where the sound is coming from. But she just couldn't do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house, and at one point it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. I mean, it really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint, and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house. But then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it's 2, 3 in the morning, and it's just silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well, clearly it was some animal, or maybe it's a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. She's rationalizing the sound. It's gone now, so it can't be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing this sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary, she was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away tragically 11 years earlier in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of, his death. This is something that they really had never been able to move past. And so as Mary is laying here in bed and she's hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks maybe it's Cora, maybe she's doing something. But really what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt and how badly she missed her husband.
Like she really just wished he was here because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate. I'm going to stay here. You go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He'd been gone for over a decade. And so eventually, even though Mary really didn't want to get up and go look for this tapping sound because truthfully, she was just scared at this point. But she's thinking about her daughter, Cora, who's downstairs and, heaven forbid there's some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house and it could be hazardous. She doesn't know. So she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter's okay. And on top of that, her daughter, Cora, had recently had this really bad case of strep throat. And while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, this is an opportunity as much as anything to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she's okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage and she takes her sheets off and she gets up out of her bed. And at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It's all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she's out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door and there's nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she's looking out, but there's nothing. And the house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It's like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what? The sound has stopped. Everything's okay. I'm sure Cora's okay. I'm getting back in bed and I'm going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed. She did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled him up to her chin, and just hoped the sound wouldn't come back. And it didn't. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately kind of took stock and realized, okay, I'm okay. Everything seems fine in the house. She listened and didn't hear any knocking sounds. And she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits. And so Mary just kind of, breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign. But there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat. And then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she didn't really even know what they meant. She was kind of spooked by it, didn't want to scare her daughter, so it never came up. But they're chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there's very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen, in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the same sounds she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora as well is looking at her mom like, did you hear that? And Mary's like, you heard that too? You heard that tapping? And Cora's like, yeah, I think it's coming from the cellar. And Mary, she's like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, well, it sounds like it's in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they're rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is.
So Mary, who by now is frantically seeking a rational, non-creepy explanation for the events, rushes down the stairs into the basement. She begins searching for mice, hoping to prove that they were the source of the noise. But as she scans the room, there's not a single mouse in sight. Suddenly, the knocking returns, only this time, it's not coming from the basement at all, it's echoing from somewhere above her. Immediately, she hears Cora's startled reaction from the kitchen upstairs. Mary bolts back up to find Cora visibly shaken. Cora gasps, I heard it. It was right here in the kitchen. I didn't see anything, but the moment you stepped down there, the sound started. At this stage, Mary is gripped by a fear she can no longer ignore. She doesn't know what this is, but it's gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so Mary said, you know what? I'm going next door. They had a friend who lived next door, a guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door. And when he came, she explained that there's something happening. There's knocking sounds happening in my house. It's scaring me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, absolutely. I'll be over in a second. And so Mary goes back to her house and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen and periodically they're hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over
And he comes inside, and right away, when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary's like, "What is that?" And Cora, she's totally spooked. And the guy's like, "I think it's your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is." And so Mary and Cora, they're like, "Great. He seems pretty confident that that's all this is." And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he's checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he's checking all these different areas that as he's checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it's not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he's working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, when the tapping got really loud, and it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing because it's nowhere near here, it's behind us. And the man, he turned around and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face is ashen. He really looked pretty upset. And he said, "The last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they couldn't get out. And they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like." After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, "I'm sorry, I can't help you." And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so Mary and Cora, they're left wondering, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she couldn't believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. I mean, he knows she's grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she's thinking about what he told her. That it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if these are ghosts? What if it's my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago trying to get my attention? What if they're trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued. And the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they'd come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house. And sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they'd all hear the tapping sounds. And nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers. People are talking about it all over the place. And in some ways, that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight. But they also really didn't know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they're sitting at the table weighing out their options. What do we even do? Even if this is, our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we can't live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on, do we eventually move? And so they're having that kind of discussion. And as they're sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It's practically on top of Mary and Cora, so much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started. And they both kind of looked at each other like, it's right on top of us. What's going on? And then as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of, the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she's sitting back, she saw something she had never noticed before. And immediately she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat. And she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And Sydenham's chorea has a very different set of symptoms to strep throat. This condition, which is also known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly and not even know they're doing it. And so what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound, but had no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by Sydenham's chorea. Now, it seems like, well, how didn't Mary catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times Mary was not in the same room